الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at ICNYU where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
Bismillah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So we're looking at a text, it's called the Book of Assistance by Imam Al-Haddad, rahimahullah. If you want to pull it up on your phones, you just Google the Book of Assistance PDF and it'll come up. We've been reading through the text. We're on chapter 4 now, on the inner and outer self. This is a text for those who aren't familiar. I know we've been doing this on Monday nights, but for the coming weeks, next week we'll do Wednesday again, and then the week after we'll do Tuesday night, and then once the academic semester starts again, we'll be on Mondays, along with doing iftar again on Mondays, the way we were doing during the fall term, inshallah. So people want to plan to be here on Wednesday next week and then Tuesday the week after as well, inshallah. So this text, if it's the first time you're with us, is a text on spirituality, and it presents essentially a roadmap for its reader in very easily digestible chapters that go through topics. They're not necessarily meant to be understood in isolation of each other, but to see how they kind of connect and lay a roadmap that one would actively traverse in seeking to engage in inward increase of their spiritual self. Right, and just to kind of recap some of the things we talked about last semester, we're just going through it really slowly. Right, so these are short chapters, a few pages each, and we went through 3 of them so far. Right, a definition to spirituality that we gave was something that was not divorced, but synergizes within our religious framework. Spirituality, religion, and ethics, they infuse together. They're not seen as things kind of separate or compartmentalized in a vacuum of one another, but they all go hand in hand. And if we were to give a definition to spirituality, it's essentially the capacity to draw meaning from one's surrounding or environment. Right, and we talked about ihsan as a perception, a beauty that one draws depth, but it's attached to vision. It's a beauty that's attained through seeing something. Right, and that sense of spirituality is rooted both in a physical sight as well as a sight of the heart. And we went through the first few chapters. Yaqeen, certitude, was the first chapter. Just kind of strong faith. The idea was that this was set as a destination, that each of us as individuals, not meant to be in isolation or lonely, but still recognizing that our entry points are unique because none of us is the rest of us. We're all who we are as individuals. We're given a common destination as a starting point, right? The goal is there so that wherever we're beginning, we're still working towards that individually. Then he talks about niyyah, intention, in the second chapter, that you know what you're doing before you set out to do it. Right? There's an awareness, a consciousness. You're not in a default setting, running just as a body mindlessly, but you bring intentionality to what you do. And then the third chapter was on muraqabah, or vigilance, right? That you have an awareness of the divine, that you're watching over your heart so that your heart in turn watches over you. And every so often you are revisiting its state as you move back through this kind of roadmap of a journey, so to speak. And now we're looking at the chapter on the inner self and the outer self. And it's a little bit distinct now from these first 3 chapters because yaqeen, niyyah, and muraqabah, right? Certitude, intention, and vigilance, they're all actions that are rooted in the heart, right? These are things that have a relationship, a connection to one's heart in particular. And when we're interjecting now a chapter that's on the inner and outer self, it's creating an opportunity for us to see ourselves more holistically. That as much as you are not just your physical being is still a part of you. And the process now of self-actualization and self-awareness begins with a recognition that the first three steps that Imam al-Haddad is outlining are purely identified as steps that are acts of the heart, right? Your niyyah, its places in the heart. Muraqabah is a vigilance of the heart. Yaqeen is a faith that's rooted in the heart. But there's an active component to all of these things as well. They're not just concepts, they're things that you can exert actively. And they become distinct now from the fourth chapter, because the inner self and the outer self, they're not just limited to a conversation on the heart. Do you get what I'm saying? And he's allowing now for an emphasis on the most important part of you, which is the qalb, the spiritual heart, but moving in a trajectory that also says there's many components to you that make you who you are in your entirety. And so this inner self and outer self is introduced in chapter 4. It's not the very first thing, because the most important thing is this. And then from there, you start to see now what's the relationship between the inward in its entirety, as well as the outward in relation to the inward. What I want you to do just for a few minutes is talk to each other about what are some of the links before we move into this fourth chapter that you can connect. Yaqeen, certitude, niyyah, intention, and muraqabah, vigilance of the heart. How do these things relate to each other, right? Because you don't want to understand religion in this kind of Sunday school rote memorization that doesn't allow for there to be application of things. The companions of the Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, all of them did not memorize the whole Quran. Many of them actually knew just little parts of the Quran. All of them were not prolific transmitters of hadith. Most of them actually didn't narrate that many hadith to begin with, of the names that you likely know very well, let alone the names that you don't know. They don't really have necessarily any narrations committed to them at all. But the understanding is that what they knew, they linked it to an active engagement, right? That the knowledge was connected to an implementation of it, and it was understood through different prisms of information, right? Like if you know Surah Al-Asr, and you know Surah Al-Kawthar, and you know Surah Ikhlas, and in all your prayers, you just Surah Kawthar, Surah Ikhlas, Surah Kawthar, Surah Ikhlas. And there's no problem with that. There's literal hadith where companions went to complain to the Prophet about other companions because they would just read Surah Ikhlas all the time. But they were doing it. And if you do it, that's fine too. The point of what I'm saying is, how do you understand Surah Al-Asr in relation to Surah Al-Ikhlas? How do you understand the verses in terms of what they mean by putting them in relation to each other, right? So when we talk about yaqeen, even if you weren't here, we talk about niyyah, we talk about muraqabah. What's the link between these things? And that link can be between two of them, all three of them. So how does yaqeen relate to niyyah? How does it relate to muraqabah? How does muraqabah relate to niyyah? How do all three of them connect to one another? What's like the relationship between these things? And if we talk about it for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and start this chapter on the inner self and the outer self. Does that make sense? So if you turn to the people next to you, ideally in pairs, right? So that everybody's talking, but if you need to have more than a pair, then maybe like three, Don't let anybody not talk to somebody. So invite people to sit and talk with you. And if you want to talk in more than a pair so that more of you are talking to each other, that would be great. And then we'll come back and discuss. Okay, so what are some of the things that come up? Any like links between these three concepts, these three things? Yaqeen, Niyyah, Muraqabah, certitude, intention, and vigilance. What did you discuss? Yeah.
So we were discussing one link between vigilance and intention. So if someone is thinking of benefiting another person and his intention is clean, but the words he chooses might be offensive to the other person, in that case, this is like how vigilance can be connected to intention. So while your intention is right, but you have to be vigilant enough that the other person does not feel offended, even if you are like trying to do benefit to them.
Great. Yeah. Well, any other thoughts? What's the connection between any of these? Yeah.
So basically, we see it's kind of a puzzle. I think that when you know that, Allah exists and Islam is a religion, you're certain about that, but there is niyyah here that is here to remind you every day. Now actually just remember that, just remember that and put it in your actions. Then we have the police, which is the inner and the outer self. So this is helping you just to stay and do things right. So that's how I think, basically how things are connected.
Other thoughts? Anything? Yeah.
I think that all of these things basically are related to how clear you are in your, you talked about the end goal and the end vision, and all of these things would happen more easily if you were, the more aware you are, the more self-aware you are, and you constantly remind yourself, and your heart is constantly purifying itself. So all of these things become more easier for you, especially when you intend on doing something, the same action becomes completely different in its meaning if you put an intention to it, and that happens. I feel that it comes to you more easily the more you keep clarifying your vision and your end goal, and you keep reminding yourself, and your heart keeps reminding you, okay, this is where we're headed, and this is what we need to do, the steps we need to take. So
Yeah, do we understand the point of the exercise, right? There's so many of us who pray with our bodies, but we don't pray with our hearts. There's a lot of us who read the Quran, but it doesn't necessarily become transformative. Because belief is here, and ritual is here, and it's rotely memorized, and you could spit out things. If I said, who is Allah, you could tell me something abstractly. But if you don't think how your conviction relates to your ritual, then how are you praying to God if you've never thought about prayer in relation to God? You see, they're not separate in that sense. There has to be a connection there, right? And then you start to trickle it into other things, right? What does yaqeen mean to me? And how do I then understand the importance of intention in relation to this thing of yaqeen? How do I understand it in a way that enhances and nuances my intention? That I'm not just learning concepts so that somebody asks me a question, I can answer it. These are meant to be principles that are actualized. And they lead now to a state that renders balance, and that balance becomes a key catalyst to contentment, right? So that I'm not in a place where everything feels like it's in a frenzy. And this section now on the inner and outer self is going to be important, because we're not meant to be people who only are focused on one or the other, but an understanding of how both make us who we are in our entirety, as well as then being able to understand what that means when we're connecting to other people, and where and how we relate to them in terms of understanding that they have both an external, which is apparent, and an internal, which is hidden. And we can only see what we can physically see, but that doesn't mean we can't have an awareness of what goes beyond what is most apparent, what is most simplistic. Do you get what I'm saying? So I'd like you to discuss now with each other again, what are we talking about when we say the inner self and the outer self, right? The zahir and the batin. What are we talking about? What is your inner self and what is your outer self? And think really deeply about everything that exists with you that is externalized. And then think about what it is that exists that is internal, that is a part of you. Does that make sense? So I'd like you to talk to the persons next to you, because if we don't know and have a base definition of the terms, they're not going to necessarily be relevant, because we're working in an ambiguous sphere, right? We're going to keep saying things, inner self, outer self, but you're then just thinking about something that doesn't have structure to it, right? The way that you know what a table is or a chair is, and we have a common working definition. We can say floor, we can say ceiling. We know the meanings of things through their names. And we pick up more as we learn more. We don't all have a common definition to these terms, inner self and outer self, but many of us probably don't have any definition to it. And so we want to start there before we start to delve into it. Does it make sense? So if you talk to the persons next to you, what does this mean? Inner self and outer self, right? What are we talking about here concretely when we're referring to these terms? So go ahead and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so what are some of the things that we discussed? What is the inner self? What are we talking about when we refer to it? And you don't want to be in a place where you only talk because you feel like you know the right answer only. Right? Because these aren't things that necessarily have absolute exhaustive answers to them. And one of the ways that we gain is by hearing from each other, including you. At the same time, when you speak, you want to take ownership over your point. So at times what we think is inclusive language, by saying we, tends to sometimes be more exclusionary than we might realize. So make I statements when you're referring to certain things. And be in a place where whatever anybody says, don't jump to correct them, because that's not the whole point of this, right? But just listen to each other, you know? So what are we talking about when we say the inner self? Let's start there, and then we'll talk about the outer self. What's the inner self? Anybody? Yeah.
I sort of connected the inner self to the 3 points made before about yaqeen, muraqabah, and niyat. Those are 3 principles that we have to accept internally, and the way we perceive those actions physically from an outer point of view is our outer self. So we apply those 3 things that we perceive, we gain internally, and apply it to external doings.
Okay. What else? Like if I'm a 7-year-old and I come to you and I say, hey, what's inside of you? Muslim? Like what would you say? 7-year-old Muslim? What's inside of you? What would you tell that person? What would you tell this kid? How can you beautify something if you don't know what it is? Right? And if you don't know, or you're scared to talk about the most important part of you, how can you possibly be taking care of it? The Prophet makes dua consistently, saying, Ya Allah, as you have beautified my outer self, beautify my character. Right? We're going to talk about a dua in a little bit where he says that make my inner self better than my outer self and make my outer self righteous. What makes your inner self whole? What is a part of your inner self? What do you think?
It's al-akhlaq.
Your akhlaq, your character?
Because the Prophet ﷺ says, always, Allahumma kama hassanta khalqi hassan khuluq.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. So, I think a huge part of the inner self is the akhlaq or al-khuluq, so it's like the way how you treat others, the way how you have respect towards like everyone, and I think also the inner self is like like there's a huge part inside you where you most of the time you cannot reflect it to other or like express yourself in a way that you might be thinking about someone in a way, but you're like a bit afraid that if you express this like these thoughts, then he or she might think, you know, like in a bad way.
Great. So if we extrapolate things from this, right? We're hearing about character, etiquette, values, virtues. We're also hearing about thoughts. All these things are taking place inside of you, right? You can't hold a thought in a hand, it's inside of you. Your core belief, your cognitive structure, it's all inside of you. These things that happen, they're inside of you. Waswasa, when it comes, it hits the sadr, the outer layer of the heart, right? Fi sudurin nas. It's what it's there, right? These are things that exist, they're taking place within us. Your feelings, where do they exist? Is your feeling sitting on top of your knee right now? Is it? Can you hold your feeling in your hand? It's not a hard question. Can you hold your feeling in your hand? No, right? Where is it?
Inside.
It's inside of you. Where inside of you is it?
The
Huh? No, are you asking me or are you telling me? Huh?
It's in the brain.
When you feel sad, where is your sadness? Huh? You feel it everywhere. Great. When you feel joy, where do you feel it? Right? The seat of some of these things are things that we have definition to. You have inwardly the spiritual heart, and it has layers to it. Its outer layer is the sadr, right? Rabbi shrah li sadri is the dua, that Allah expand for me my chest. You have then the layer that's called the qalb, the spiritual heart. You then have within that the fu'ad. This is the place where emotions reside, right? As the Quran speaks about Musa alayhi salam's mother having anxiety as she places the baby into the water, it talks about the fu'ad. And then you have the most inner part, the lub, right? Which is likened now to the relationship of a pupil to an eye, or the Kaaba to the city of Mecca, right? The lub has that relationship to the heart on a whole. That heart in its entirety is not existing now on its own. In your inner self, you have your ruh, the soul, that the Quran itself speaks about, that says that we don't really know so much about it, you and I. Allah, the creator of the arwah, that is all of us, has a soul within us. Allah knows this, but you and I have limited knowledge of that ruh that makes us uniquely human. But that's in there. You have irada, sheer will and determination. You have aql, the intellectual capacity to discern right from wrong, but not in a moral relativism. Not what you think is right or wrong, but the aql is about discerning right from wrong based off of what Allah has determined is right and wrong. You have the nafs, the lower self, that has different frames of existence as well. The nafs al-amara bisu, the nafs that commands to that which is not good, the nafs al-lawama, the self-reproaching nafs that understands the good that it does, that it can do better, and that the things that it does not do well, where it can improve. And then the nafs al-mutma'inna, may Allah grant us a nafs that's like that, a nafs that's in a state of ease and contentment. All these things are within you, but the crazy thing is that they, just like your physical body, are connected to the rest of you. So when you feel sadness, you feel it everywhere, right? Because all of you is connected to the rest of you. Is there any part of you that is not connected to any other part of you? No. There's some parts of you that can leave from you. You can still claim that they're yours, right? If I spit and the spit comes out, I can say that's my spit, but it's not in me anymore, right? So like if you're fasting and you have spit in your mouth and you swallow it, it's not a good habit. Some people would say it's makruh. It doesn't break your fast. But if you spit in your hand and then for some reason you lick it back up, you broke your fast. So don't do that. There are things that make you who you are in your entirety. And as we go into this chapter, when Imam al-Haddad is going to start right in the beginning, or the du'as that the Prophet ﷺ teaches us, that we say again and again, you got to understand what it is that they apply to. And what these different parts of you are that aren't simply just things that are outward. Because you want to be able to pray with your heart. You want to be able to make dua with your heart. You want to be able to also love with your heart and feel from your heart and allow for the heart to be in control, not the nafs, not the body, right? Some of you have heard me say this, where even in our physical construction, Allah has given an illustration. The higher self is the place where your heart and your mind reside. The lower self is where your stomach and your sexual organs reside, right? You want to appeal to the higher self, not the lower self. But if you don't know what makes your inner, then how are you going to make it more beautiful? How are you going to take care of it? How are you going to allow for it to be something that you don't compromise or sacrifice simply for the gain of things that are outward? Does it make sense? What else exists within you? You got a lot of memories inside of you, right? They don't exist sitting in a box somewhere. They're sitting inside of you. It's a mercy from God that we have the ability to forget certain things. Can you imagine if you could remember every single time you felt pain? What that would be like? But doesn't mean there's not certain things that are still there. And if you know how all of you connects to the rest of you, and you know how those memories and feelings of guilt, the sins you have committed, that you somehow believe are greater than Allah's mercy, that when shaitan's waswasa, that is an outward, comes now to your inward, it knows how to manipulate you and get you to be vulnerable to those things that you wished weren't stuck in your head, but they're still there. You understand? And so you got to know what the entirety is and how you are bigger than all of any one part of it. Because even when you feel sad, if all of you feels the sadness, somebody's still got to be feeling the feeling at the end of the day. So who's feeling that feeling? It's you on a whole. You're not the feeling, it's just one part of you. Just like you are not any one of your thoughts, because then who's thinking the thoughts? Do you understand? What's the outer self?
Whatever we do.
What we do?
Yeah.
Okay. Actions?
Actually.
Yeah.
I think the behavior and the things that we present to others, and the part of our personality that we show to others, our behaviors, our thoughts, that would be the outer self.
Okay.
What I think.
Good. What else?
Our appearance. Our appearance.
Your appearance? What did you say?
Things that are visible to others and are valued most by the society.
Things that are visible to others and valued by society. Yeah, right? Your outer self is literally like your outer self. You know? What you look like, how you dress. You live in a society that teaches you to look at yourself more than it teaches you to look for yourself.
Yeah.
Do you understand what that means?
Yeah.
There's a reason why you can go into hotels. I told my kids this the other day. We just went for Umrah. May Allah accept it from us. And we then went to Zanzibar after that. And we're in these hotels that are like super large, right? I don't know why, but my kids, for whatever reason, they loved like the clock tower in Mecca. I was like, this thing looks like it's straight out of like a Lord of the Rings movie, man. What are you talking about? They're like, no, Baba, it's so nice looking. And it's huge. You can go into any hotel in any part of the world, and at the elevators, especially the places where the elevators take you 20, 30 minutes to come, they put mirrors at the elevators. Do you know why? Because you like looking at yourself. And they know that that's going to make a difference in keeping you from getting agitated because you're waiting for an elevator. Because the only thing that's going to help you not get upset when you're waiting for so long and you feel entitled that you shouldn't be waiting is that you just get to look at yourself more. And the mirror is there. It's built in. The physicality of everything is always the focal point. Our tradition is not in denial of it. Because the dua that we're saying is that just like you have made my outer self beautiful, make my character beautiful. The Prophet's not saying he's ugly or that the way that he looks is unimportant. The dua that we're going to look at in a little bit, where he's relating his inner to his outer, but when it's only the outer, and it's constantly the outer, and then there's not a sense of what makes you inwardly who you are, a byproduct of a capitalistic supremacist society is that it gets you to believe that the thoughts that you think are your own thoughts, when in reality the thought that you think are the thoughts that they want you to think. They want you to think that your skin color is not good unless it's the lightest of the light skin colors. They want you to think that the only way that you can find satisfaction is based off of wealth or a house or children or being married or any of these things. I'm not saying that they're good or bad, but there's nothing that is categorically a ni'mah, a blessing for every single person other than iman. And I can introduce you to people who are married and marriage is hell for them. Just like I can introduce you to people who are married and marriage is a blessing for them. There's no way to say that it's absolutely one thing or the other. But you don't know why you want it so much. You don't know why you want that job or you want that degree or you want that grade. And when the inner is not understood and the outer is what is emphasized, many of us pursue what we pursue not because we believe that necessarily there's good in it for us, but we believe that if we are not that, then we are somehow lacking. That I'm only beautiful if I have X, Y, or Z. Your prophet did not have that much. If you go to Medina and you see the size of his home, you read the hadith where it talks about how he would get up from sleep and his back is covered with marks because he is sleeping on the trunks of date palm trees, and the companions have tears brought to their eyes, and they are asked why, and they say, like the kings of Persia and the Romans live in such luxury and opulence, and look, Ya Rasulullah, how you live. But the Prophet knows the proportionality of this world in relation to the next. And that's what his existence is. When he would pray tahajjud, the hadith says that sometimes he would move Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha's legs out of the way, because that's how small their house was. She'd be laying down and he's going to prostrate and her feet are there. There's not room to really do too much. He still is making dua that's acknowledging that he has a beautiful outer self. He buried most of his children, had fights with a lot of his family members, was cast out by so many people, but his inner thoughts are still rooted in what is positively affirming. You understand? And he didn't need wealth, he didn't need influence, even when they said to him, like, worship our God for a day and yours for a day, ours for a day and yours for a week, yours for a month, yours for a year. We'll give you all the land that you want. You want power? We'll make you a king. You can have riches, wealth. He's like, that's not what this is about. He didn't need that to have that inner sense that then yielded these du'as that we're talking about. That, Ya Allah, as you have made my outer self beautiful, make my inner self beautiful. Do you see what I mean? And if you don't know what the inner is, and you don't know what is outward also, on a spiritual level, there are both inward and outward adversaries as well. You have what's called dunya, the materialistic world. We have waswasa, shaitan's whispers. And then you have inwardly what is called hawa, desire. And then we have the nafs as well. And you start to think about now the relationship between all of these things. What you've been exposed to growing up, societally, culturally, socially. What makes you you? How you relate to what exists around you. And how the inner part to yourself is still carrying a lot of these things. You see what I mean? Does this make sense? We can continue on in this way. When you have some time tonight, you have some time tomorrow, you go into the weekend, just think about these two concepts because they're very important. Not abstractly, not theoretically. You literally have a heart inside of you, right? And you just think about this analogously. How many of us know even how our physical internal works? Right? You put all kinds of garbage into your body. Things that make no sense in terms of what it's actually doing to your inner workings. And I'm not saying this is a good or a bad, but just think, how do you get to that point? What creates an absence of really understanding? How does my physical heart work? What does exercise really do for my body? All that mess of sugar that I'm eating every single day, about half a pound of sugar from bread and pasta and carbs and other stuff, every day, not in a week, every day, what is it doing to me in terms of my mood, my emotions, my energy? Nobody teaches you those things on purpose. Because they want you to just think about success in terms of outward, external success. Our tradition teaches us that you are beautiful as a base default. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. That's from Allah, not from anybody else. He made you in the most beautiful of forms, inward and outward. You understand? So you gotta spend some time and think about, what do these things actually mean? These words that I'm making dua for. Let's start reading from here. Somebody can just start from the beginning. Chapter 4 on the inner and outer self. You must, O my brother, improve your inward aspect. Who wants to read? Go ahead.
You must, O my brother, improve your inward aspect until it becomes better than your virtuous outward appearance, for the former is where the gaze of the real obtains, while the latter is where the envious gaze of creation is to be found. God never mentioned the inward and the outward in his book without beginning with the inward, and the prophet used to pray, may blessings and peace be upon him, O God, make my inward better than my outward, and make my outward virtuous.
Okay, so an important principle here, right? When it talks about the real, it's talking about Allah. What it's saying is that Allah is not looking at your bodies. This is in the hadith. Allah does not look at your images. Allah is al-musawwir. He's the one that made you look how you look in the first place. But he looks to your hearts and he looks to your actions. So the idea is that you start to look where Allah looks. You start to spend time engaged in inward exploration. Improve your inward aspect until it becomes better than your virtuous outward appearance. For the former is where the gaze of the real obtains, while the latter is where the envious gaze of creation is to be found. There's 3 different ways that you can introspect through this sense of self-categorization. The first 2 that we'll talk about are rooted in this latter part, the envious gaze of creation, that gives us now either a superiority or inferiority, but both still delusional senses of self. A superiority understanding is delusional senses of grandeur, comparing to others and why I am better than them. An inferiority is a delusional sense of insignificance, while everyone else around me is always better than I am. What the text is recommending and what our spiritual tradition recommends is you want to have a vision that is interiority based. You're just looking within. You're not in a competition with anybody else. It's just the person you are today is not afraid to meet the person you can become tomorrow. And so you don't line yourself up in comparison, nor do you make a point to assess people in these ways. You start to then recognize that what makes somebody sound, what makes me sound, and I understand the part to myself that I want to look at quite often. Doesn't mean you don't look at your outer appearance, right? Nobody's saying that. But it's saying that you want to make the inner better and you want to spend time. And the reason why he's saying is because Allah looks at your hearts. He's not looking just at the outward. When I went for Umrah, it was my son who's 7, my daughter's 10, my wife. We had 3 other families with us. The youngest kid is 6, and the oldest kid was 12. Somebody said, why do we wear this ihram thing? Why can't we wear perfume? Why can't I use soap that's scented? And they're little kids. One of the ideas with ihram is that you're removing all of these things that are just focused on the outward alone. You're creating an opportunity to come in masses where everybody is uniform externally. The same way where some of you have already, and some of you eventually will, inshallah, sit at a graduation ceremony of some kind in your life. Whether that was when you were in 5th grade, going to middle school, or going to high school, or out of high school, or if you went to college, out of college, or masters, or whatever, everybody sits and they are dressed the same. And they pull that tradition, the long cloaks and the head coverings, from Islam. And the idea is that there's a uniformity that presents itself. That you are successful, but everybody else is successful too. And nobody is sitting stewing in their seat at graduation, being like, I'm so mad that the guy behind me graduated. The Hajj, the Umrah, it's removing now what creates stratification in societies. And it's compelling you to be comfortable. And people become so insecure because they're now stuck in this place. How can I go these many hours without deodorant? How can I do this? Where I can't wear perfume. It's like, well, you can, man. You have to experience it. And all those doubts, they're coming from shaitan whispering to you because somebody has created a core belief within you that says your outward is the source of strength, not your inward. Imam al-Haddad, he's saying that, no, you draw strength from in here. This is where courage comes from. This is where integrity is rooted. This is the seat of good character, of all things that are going to give you a sense of wholeness to you. Do you see? How does one actually look at their inner self? I'd like you to turn to the person next to you and talk about this. What can you do to actually, practically, take a look and understand the state of your inner self? Does the question make sense? So let's talk for 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss.
According to society standards, it's very hard to recognize like a beauty within yourself.
Is it also is the one that finds itself? Yeah, just recognize
How others would recognize you from my outer appearance than what they would recognize me from.
which one is just question was the reason how you
Sometimes imagining it you're the only person who can start
like learning the process of how to identify feelings, feel the feelings, identify parts of feelings. So, listen to process. I mean, I've been working for 5 years, going on 6 years, but I do love it.
Sometimes I think we do because we're so busy.
Can't you say that the other way around? Like if I die, how would people remember me as?
That's what the first thing is.
What is my legacy?
Is that related to illness? Like if people can remember you as a super genius person,
That is maybe from the outer world.
yeah, but it's possible not to use it just to show off.
That's true. Yeah.
There's this lecture series I'm watching.
It's a good thing, I think.
Just like going to
I guess
there's
it could be like, you know, there could be thoughts on the way of, you know, the end will be great. So, and we don't know, like, you know,
the way
at the time when the boss that we could have praised and stuff like that, but
different types of people. And then you're able to say, well, where am I?
yeah, I think and there's something
Which is you know, that allows me to analyze how words
it's not that we can't figure it out.
Okay, so what do we come up with? How do you look at your inner self, or how do you assess what the state of it is? Yeah.
I'll share a method that I do. Sometimes I record conversations that I have with Allah. So when time passes by, like days or something, I could listen back and just hear where I was at that time, and now analyze myself that way.
That's so
and
nice.
also writing.
Great. What else? What are ways that we can kind of understand what's going on inside of us?
I think it's always the outer self that really tell us what's happening inside.
How does it do that?
So it depends. Let's say the inner is reflected in our actions. So you can have all the ideas how good you are, but when it comes to actions, your real self, your real inner self will just come out in actions. So this is the thing that will kind of help us to know where we are at, try to correct, improve, or just ignore, depending on how our iman is. But I think it's always the outer self that help us understand how we are inside, or what we are inside.
Great. That's important if we can flesh it out to specifics, right? So we don't leave things ambiguous. Do you know what I mean? Some of these conversations are going to be hard, right? But if you are consistently hurting somebody, then it's telling you something about the state of your inside. If you are constantly gossiping, constantly lying, constantly cheating, this is different. And emotional intelligence, one of its buckets, is about being able to accurately name things. So what you might perceive as anger is actually sadness. If you keep telling yourself you're angry, when in reality you're just sad, doesn't mean that you're not sad still at the end of it. You can convince yourself of whatever it is. How you treat others, the decisions that you make, the choices that you make, they're going to then be reflective of what is actually going on within you. Your physical body can tell you certain things. There's sometimes when we're so sad that it makes our head hurt. There's sometimes when we're so anxious that we literally can't breathe. At some point, you got to pay attention to the signs. At some point, you have to start to think about these things. And you wake up to it. If you are in a place where you are somehow justifying mistreatment of somebody, then that's just doubling down in a place that makes no sense. And we can create accountability with concrete reflections, writings, things that don't have you remember yesterday through who you are today and convincing yourself that you were something yesterday that you actually weren't. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're in a place where you're actually engaged in different things that are not going to all look the same for everybody, right? I don't really like talking to people. You might say, that's crazy. You talk so much, nobody else ever gets to talk. If it were up to me, I'd just be sitting at home on my couch with my kids, and sometimes not even with them, just by myself. When I was growing up, and I was in middle school and high school, I didn't get bullied, alhamdulillah. I wasn't kind of an outcast, I had friends, but I was just really quiet. I didn't really talk so much. We go to people's houses, I just kind of sit there. People would say, is there something wrong with you? There's something wrong with you? Like, there's nothing wrong with me. I just don't like talking. That's not a problem. My wife, when I met her and got to know her, I realized that I'm not actually introverted at all. Like, she is definitely introverted. And so the way certain things will manifest with us isn't because one is better or worse, but I can sit and, alhamdulillah, talk to anybody and gain energy from it and keep going and keep running. And my wife, there'll be times when after like a few days, she's like, I don't want to see anybody. I'm just going to go sit in this room. And she's not like telling this to my children. She's telling even me. She's like, you just go stay over there and I'm going to be over here. Because she just needs to replenish. And that's fine. You have to have it be tailored to you. Because of waswasa, because of knowing how the outward relates to the inward, because of superiority and inferiority, complexes that then have us hate on ourselves. This is not saying that everybody has to always be smiling at everyone. That everyone has to always be social and greeting people and this and that. No, like some of us, it's okay that you just like your space and that's fine. You don't have to be like 100% all the time on. It can be exhausting. Do you understand what I mean? The exercise has to have awareness of who you are as a person and where and how you relate to certain things. Some of us, we get not so much in a good mood in the wintertime. When the days are shorter, the nights are longer, the weather's cold, it impacts us. That's totally fine. You just have awareness of yourself. You know what's going on inside of you. Do you get it? So it then doesn't turn into this place of, look, I'm so terrible, everything's terrible, the world is terrible. No, man, you don't like the cold. I don't like the cold. There's nothing wrong with me. And it's just cold. And that's fine. Do you get what I'm saying? The decisions you make, the choices you make, your interactions, your etiquettes, these types of things will be data points more than anything. And your willingness to be open to not simply acknowledging the things that are not okay that you do, but being able to acknowledge your actual capacity to do what is good, which will be that much harder, both will become necessary in recognizing what is the state of my inward. Do you see what I mean? The second part that's really important to this is that sometimes you'll need a space to talk it out loud so that you don't answer questions with things that are not necessarily applicable. When I had this woman came to see me, and she's a doctor, went through med school, residency, pre-med, MCATs, stress for a decade in her life. She's sitting and she's talking to me, and she's in a place where she's not praying her prayers. And all of the negative rhetoric comes. What's the point of me even eating like the biha, halal food? Why should I fast? I'm not praying, none of it makes a difference. You're like, hold on, man. That's not how this works. And she starts to tell me about everything else going on in her life. Challenges with family, challenges with relationships, challenges here, challenges there. There's literal heaviness sitting inside of her. And I said, you probably have an adhan app on your phone, and because you're so exhausted, whenever you hear it and you shut it off, you're just telling yourself, look at how bad you are. You're silencing the adhan. You're not getting up to pray. And she said, I have 3 apps on my phone. I said, you're not praying because of prayer, but all this other stuff that's sitting inside of you is making it hard to literally get up. You see? And where the waswasa comes, it's, you're a bad Muslim. You're a bad Muslim. You don't deserve Islam. Allah is going to punish you. This is why you don't have this. This is why you don't have that. This is why you've lost this. This is why you've lost that. Do you see what I mean? And when we have hadith that says that we're mirrors to each other, you find somebody that's going to be empathetic in their listening, not listening to respond. Everybody cannot always have an answer to everything. But somebody who's just listening to understand, they can carry some of the heaviness. So you can begin to think about what you're thinking about and recognizing what's really going on inside of me. Does this make sense? In this dua that Imam al-Haddad is quoting here, when the Prophet ﷺ is making this dua that, oh Allah, make my inward better than my outward and make my outward virtuous, right? The words that he uses for inward here, he says sarirati. He's talking about this in Arabic. When you have this root, it denotes a lot of different things, including things that are just hidden, secret. Like parts of you that are not necessarily at the forefront always. Those parts that are tucked away that nobody's eyes are upon. Make those parts better than what is apparent, what is outward. Alaniyati, he says. And then he says, make what is outward righteous. When something is salih, it's not just correct in the ways that we understand correctness, but it's done at the right time, and the action is also right. So you know how sometimes people give advice, and it just makes no sense that they're telling you this? Or they say things to you, and you're like, what are you talking about? How would you possibly think that this is the way to give somebody counsel? When the Quran says, وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا, the word sadid in Arabic is also when an arrow hits a bullseye, right? The word is something that's on target because it's said at the right time and it's at the right place, right? This is what is something that is salih. And the dua is saying, make my outer like the best, the most righteous thing, and then make my inner better than that. You get what I mean? This is really beautiful because the Prophet also knows who he's making dua to. So when you ask of Allah, you don't say, Ya Allah, give me Jannah. You say, Ya Allah, give me the highest level of Jannah. Because you're asking of God. God can give you anything. So why are you asking for the bare minimum? So when the Prophet is saying, make my heart good, he's not forgetting his body. Make my heart better than my body and make my body the best. Make my actions what are apparent, the things that come from me, like the most right that can possibly be of righteousness, and then make my inner self even better than that. You can't make a dua like that unless you really want that. And if you make dua asking Allah to make you somebody who's good, then you gotta then deal with the openings that Allah gives to you to actually be a source of good. You don't sit back, you made the dua, then the things that are going to get you to that place, you gotta actually take advantage of them. So if the Prophet is making a dua like this, then doesn't it make sense that he's constantly greeting people and he's running to help people and he's doing all of these things, telling little kids whose baby birds die things to console them, like giving of sadaqah, giving of gifts that he has that are not charity, they're not sadaqah, to people who are more in need than he is, right? Uplifting people, because he's making these du'as. These are du'as that are saying, I want what is apparent to be right, and I want what is inward to be better than what is outward. You see what I'm saying? You can't make a dua like this and then just sit down and do nothing. Like it doesn't go like that. You see? And the two go hand in hand. What time is it? When he continues, he says, when the inward is good, the outward is also inevitably so. For the outward always follows the inward, whether for good or evil. The Messenger of God, sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, has said, in the body there lies a small piece of flesh. When it is good, the rest of the body is good. And when it is corrupt, the rest of the body becomes corrupt. It is the heart, right? Ala wa inna fil jasadi mudghatan. إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب. Right? You want to memorize these hadith, not so that you can quote them, but so that you can live by them. None of this is going to be applicable if you don't believe that you have a spiritual heart. And that is the place of courage, that is the place of love, that is the place of hope, that is the place of contentment. And in order for us to understand that the heart has the potential to be sovereign, you then have to understand its capacity to not be sovereign. And something else can then be in charge of you. What is in charge of you right now? And when you're sitting now with your sisters and brothers in a place of prayer, away from offices and classrooms where you're the only Muslim, away from people that influence you bad, away from society that tells you to objectify women, to be in a place where you commodify relationships, where you think about everything in terms of dollar signs and wealth and all of this kind of stuff. You can be in a place where right now your heart is focused, which then tells you that you have the capacity to let it be what is defining and deciding. What's in charge when you wake up in the morning? and are deciding whether you're going to pray Fajr or not? What's in charge when you're going into the office place? What's in charge when you're commuting? What's in charge when you're around certain people versus other people? Do you see what I'm saying? There's not a state that you have that is always. You are going to be a product of various environments that you get situated in. Kindness that is to the self becomes important, because we have hadith that tell us that the time will come where holding on to a sunnah is going to be like holding on to a flaming coal in your hand. It's not going to be easy. May Allah make it easy for us. What's in charge for you when you are in the last nights of Ramadan looking for Laylatul Qadr? What's in charge at that point? I'm literally sitting with like 8-year-olds, man, and we're standing and they're seeing the Kaaba for the first time. And some of these kids, they're just in tears. I went to this girl who is 7 years old with us, and she's bawling. I'm like, are you okay? Why are you crying? And she's like, because I'm seeing the Kaaba. When you're in Medina and you're in Mecca, it's hard for the heart to not be in charge. The Prophet says in the hadith that one who witnesses Ramadan and is still not forgiven, like, how is that even possible? Because there's unique barakah in that time. What's in charge in other places? What's in charge in other settings? In other situations? When you're sitting in that lecture, when you're sitting in that interview, when you're sitting in any of these places, what is in charge? And if you want the heart to be in charge, then you have to allow for it to be what's in charge. You prioritize it. You give it the seat that it deserves. There's a paradox to decision making, that when you don't make a choice, you have still chosen. And it's not that most of us do not choose our hearts, it's that most of us don't choose anything. And then when you're on default settings, and you live in a society that tells you your body is going to be what makes the decision. How something feels makes the decision, right? This is why a lot of people are like, I don't feel anything in my prayer. But you're not worshiping a feeling, you're worshiping Allah. There's not going to be like this feeling every single time. The fulfillment is not because the result is the feeling. The fulfillment is because the obligation is given to you from the divine who told you that you have to do this. Do you see what I mean? And I can't tell you what's running you when you are in certain circumstances. You sometimes might also tell yourself that something is, but then your actions, your decisions, they're going to tell you what is actually kind of coming into play. Do you get what I mean? And the idea is to be as consistent as possible. So you could be the person who is pouring water to people as they break fast in Ramadan, but if you go home and you yell at everybody, then you're still going home and yelling at everybody. Do you get what I mean? This goes now into what he says next, where he says, know that the one who claims to have a thriving inward, but whose outward has been corrupted by his abandoning outward acts of obedience, is a pretender and a liar. So if you're in a place where you're talking a lot, but your actions are not reflective of what you're saying, لِمَا تَقُولُ مَا لَا تَفْعَلُونَ, the Quran says. Why do you say that which you don't do? These are reflective questions that you just sit down and you say, well, why am I not doing it? When I started working here, prior to I used to exercise a lot. I literally was in my office today, and I walked in, and my belt buckle just popped off of my belt. And I was like, man, am I getting like so fat right now? What is going on? When I was in high school, I used to work out 3 times a day. I was supposed to play sports in college. I got injured in my senior year of high school, so I couldn't play anymore. But I was going off of that kind of athletic routine. And then when I got to college, I started hanging out with more Muslims. I didn't really hang out with Muslims growing up. Muslims at NYU, where I did my undergrad, they weren't like the most athletic people in the world. They didn't really seem to be a priority for people. But I still kept going to the gym, and then some more time passed, and then eventually I started working here. And all kinds of things had demands over my schedule, and I had no self-care routine. And when anybody would then ask me about my physical wellness, I'd start talking about how I used to exercise when I was in high school. I wasn't deflecting, but I had a response. And then they would be so shocked that I was able to run as fast as I could or lift as much weight as I could, that the conversation never actually ended up being about what was I doing now. And then one day it hit me hard that I was just saying something about something that happened, and it was keeping me from actually doing anything in the moment that I was in. And by the end of my 20s, I was getting sick all the time. My weight was fluctuating a lot. It was very heavy, very light. I got an illness called shingles before I was 30 that you get when you're at a high level of stress and low point of immunity. And fundamentally, my talk is what was then inhibiting me from actually doing what it was that I needed to do. You get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Imam al-Haddad is saying here that just because you're saying it doesn't mean that you're actually doing it. You express the objective, but you also then have to put in the effort to start to get it done. And you really start to think about, well, what am I putting my heart through? How am I allowing for it to flourish and have life and vitality? Do you see what I mean? Okay. What I'd like for us to do, if you just turn to the people next to you, what are some of the things you're taking away from our conversation tonight? Anything that comes to mind, anything that's sticking with you, and then we'll come back and discuss, and then we'll wrap up for tonight. Go ahead. But it took me 7 years to find Muslims who actually reminded me of the Quran, like who looked like they were actually living like what the Quran's message was. Do you know? And it's remarkable, like when we take hadith like that, and to illustrate how you can actively understand what is really driving someone's inward based off of what's coming from outside of them, right? When you read the Quran is a text that's very conscious of itself. So it identifies itself as a guidance. It defines itself as shifa, healing, rahmah, mercy. These are all things that the Prophet ﷺ was for people, you know? It's connected there. What else? What else are we taking away, or things that come up for people? Yeah.
I think the thing that you mentioned about who's or what's in charge of you right now, and you know, something that really hit me in this lecture is that the feeling that you have, you know, for example, when you're worshipping and then you don't feel so good and you say that, oh, I don't really feel in it, and the feeling's not there, and then you stop worshipping, but you're not worshipping the feeling itself. It should be the bigger goal, you know. So that really hit me, because it just reminded me that for most of the day, what's really in charge of me is the feelings, and that's how I go about my day. For example, do I feel good about this or not? Or do I not feel good about this? And that is also something that sometimes I think makes me inconsistent in prayer, because when I see that, oh, okay, I don't really feel, maybe I'm so bad, I'm not getting that feeling that you're supposed to feel in the namaz, and that connection, so maybe I'm not doing so good in my life. And that sort of makes me inconsistent for the next prayer, But that was a useful reminder that shouldn't be the goal, the feeling. And just a realization that feelings is sort of like a reward or a punishment for me unconsciously, and that's what I'm actually chasing, not the things itself, but the feeling that I get from it. So that was a useful reminder.
Yeah, and what our emotions are, they're essentially data points, right? They're giving us insight to ourselves, Yeah. And an openness to being able to recognize, like, what is it that I feel? Feelings in and of themselves are not a mode of entitlement to then just do whatever you want, right? Well, I feel this, so then I must be able to do this. What can be categorically problematic or beneficial are the actions and responses to feelings. But Allah is the one that gave you all of your feelings in the first place. All of them serve a purpose. All of them have a benefit. And being able to understand that they're giving us insight. If you get to a place where you're feeling heavy, you're not feeling good after you pray, right? There's these kinds of things. You don't have to walk through that by yourself. You can talk that out with people who can help you to make sense of it and the clutter. Because if you are not talking to someone outwardly, Shaitan is still having a conversation with you inside. Your inner voice, your habits, your negative cognitive bias, these are all things that are very present. And there's no shortage of people who, when you try to talk to them, they're going to talk back to you in a more solution-oriented way. Maybe you should try this. Maybe you should do that. Maybe you should do that. You got to talk to somebody who's not going to tell you what to do. Sometimes you got to talk to somebody who's just going to hear what it is that you're going through. And they're just taking some of that, so you don't have to carry it by yourself. Because now the added to-dos are going to just be more things that, I feel like garbage doing these things also. Maybe I'm just a garbage human being. It's like, no, you're not a garbage human being. Everybody gets exhausted. Everybody gets tired, right? They said the Prophet wasn't the same person as who he was before Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha passed away as he was after her passing, right? He's impacted by her loss. It's called amal huzn for a reason. The Mufassirin, they say the word huzn, like sadness, grief, depression, is the experience. It's felt when you've lost something that you love, right? It's a heavy thing. What is your prayer going to feel like after you're in a place where you find out a loved one is sick, after you lose a job, you fail an exam, You have normal emotions like human feelings, right? But being able to talk that out with the right people, which are not always going to be close friends and family who love you so much that they don't want you to feel pain, and they're just going to throw all kinds of things to do as a response, but just people who are able to help you by just hearing what you're going through. You see what I mean? Does that make sense? Other things we're taking away from today? Anything that comes up for anybody? Yeah.
Well, this is kind of a broader question, but one thing that always I struggle with is this notion that Allah created certain people for Jannah and certain people for Jahannam, and I don't know what that means. Allah, also that Allah created us and what we do. I don't know what that means, but I always fear that I could be doing something, living my life a certain way, and I could be actually deceiving myself and thinking that I'm, inshallah, one of those people that will, inshallah, enter Jannah, but this could be a whole thing of self-deception, and it turns out that I'm not going to be that person. And so I when we say, who's in charge,
how much of our effort is really what makes the difference, and how much of it is Allah's will that has already written us to be that person of either the fire or the garden. You know, and that's always a struggle for me. Like, who am I in this whole story? Am I that person? Am I who I think I am? Am I really a sincere Muslim? You know, it could be shaitan kind of doing that, but you know, that's the struggle for me, and I don't know how to get past that, because that's always there, that questioning of every sort of intention, and always checking to see what am I really trying to do here? What, you know, how sincere am I? And I was asking Allah, please make me sincere, and if I am that, if I'm going to end up in the fire, then what is my effort even worth? If it is written for me that I'm going to end up there eventually.
Yeah, and I appreciate your vulnerability, because I feel like there's probably others who kind of struggle with this idea of sincerity and purpose and these bigger questions theologically. There's a paradox in our theology where absolute divine decree exists in harmony with human agency, and that's something that is just debated. It's kind of engaged in back and forth with many people, but fundamentally it's what it is, right? So we've been given accountability, and we've been given opportunity to exert like decision making. So all you gotta do is just try your best fundamentally. And I would say that the perspective is not just what do I think of myself, but understanding hadith and Quran in relation to each other, and the recommendations that tell us to think the best of our Lord at the end of all of this, right? And who you know Allah to be, understanding Him through what He has identified Himself to be through His text and through His book, and drawing a sense of hope from that. The other point that I'll say really quickly is, like, the idea is not to reflect always within oneself, but sometimes to be in a place where you get affirmation from the people that are around you, and you have people who are solid people, right? There's a grad student here at NYU who gave the khutbah here a few times in the last few weeks when I was traveling. His name is Sohaib, may Allah preserve him. Some of you know him, right? He's, leads the prayer sometimes, the Hafiz, mashallah. He's a really good guy. And I asked him, I was like, how'd your khutbah go? And he was like, yeah, it was okay. And I said, what did people say to you after? He's like, everyone said it was fine. And I was like, do you feel like anyone was actually giving you valid feedback? He was like, no. He was like, they were just going to tell me it was nice because they're nice people, right? But it's a problem. Like, the guy wants to know, did he actually give a good khutbah? That doesn't mean, like, on Friday, he's giving a khutbah, you go up to him and be like, here's all the things you said that were terrible, and this is why, right? That's not what he's asking for. But he has a desire to know, and he's not getting it from those people. So when he said this to me, I said, I'm going to go listen to the 2 recordings of your khutbahs, and we're going to sit down, and I'm going to tell you what you could do better, and I'm going to also tell you what you did well, right? You got to have people like that in your life that are able to not just be kind of superficial relationships, but they're going to love you enough and you love them enough that you trust them enough that their feedback is not something that's ornamental, but you're able to take from them words that you don't want to really hear, and you're also able to understand that sometimes words you don't want to hear are about how you're actually like a good person, and you're not like the worst thing in the world, and you could gain some insight from people around you so that you're thinking still and introspecting, but you're doing that with somebody else. Do you see what I mean? The Prophet had doubts, right? When he comes down from Hira, he thinks he's lost his mind. And he's trying to reconcile what's taking place, and he believes he's been possessed by demons and jinns, and he thinks he's been forsaken by God. Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha gives him affirmation. When he comes from Isra and Miraj, he has to convince people that he takes this majestic journey from one city to another and ascends into the heavens and comes back down, and people start to apostate. Everybody doesn't believe him. Some people mock him and ridicule him, and then they start mocking his followers, and those people leave. And the Prophet has Abu Bakr, who comes and sits, and he hears from these people who are mocking. Do you know what your friend wants us to believe? He wants us to believe that he went from this city to Jerusalem all in a night and ascended into the heavens and came back down. He says, if my friend said it, then it must be true. And then he's sitting where he's telling what's taking place, and every so often Abu Bakr radiallahu anh says, Sadaqt, Sadaqt, Sadaqt. He's spoken the truth, he's spoken the truth, he's spoken the truth. What do you think it does for the Prophet in terms of affirmation? No, he's not alone, right? The people don't listen to him at Hudaybiyah when they don't perform Hajj. They've wanted to go back to Mecca for years. And he says, remove your ihram, slaughter your animals, we're going back to Medina. Nobody does anything. And he goes into his tent, he talks to Salama, he says, nobody's listening to me. And she says, if they see you do it, they will do it also. So he does what she says to do. And they see him doing it, and then they follow suit. But he turns to somebody that makes sense to turn to. If you are only turning to yourself, and you don't have like people that you can engage, that you open up and then you take from them feedback, it's going to be harder to then be able to assess. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? And just figure out, who are those people? And the ones that can help me to recognize who it is that I fully am. Most of us are like really great people, mashallah. You're not out there committing like highway robbery, right? You know? Like really, right? You're not like, I mean, like, look at some of the disgusting people in the world. May Allah protect us from it. Every day I go to bed, I sit and I think about things I'm grateful for. I'm so, subhanAllah, grateful that Allah has given me Islam. Because I don't know, like, where I would be if I was reliant purely on my own sense of morality as being what was my kind of guiding compass in making decisions. It's something that tells me that, like, no, you're supposed to treat people nice. You value everybody, regardless of their backgrounds, race, class, ethnicity. You do not abuse, you do not oppress, you do not hurt. There's structure that's there, right? A lot of people, they don't have that. Do you know what I mean? That interiority becomes important because it can adopt a growth mindset. And then you juxtapose that not to like what society tells you to think about God, but what God tells you to think about God. And the Prophet says to have like a good impression of your Creator. Do you get what I mean? Right? But when you believe you cannot be forgiven for something you have done, and there's no point to seeking forgiveness, or there's no point to doing certain things, it's not just telling you what you think about yourself, but it's telling you what you think about Allah. You understand? And they just sit and think, like, is that who I want to really worship at the end of the day? Do you know? Like, do I worship a God that I believe does not have the capacity or desire to forgive me when I seek forgiveness? I wouldn't want to believe in that God. I believe in a God that is the most merciful of those who show mercy, whose love for me is not conditional, but He is al-Wadud. And He loves me not because of who I am or who I am not, but He loves me because of who He is, Azza wa Jal, just like He loves you. And then finding strength through that God and being able to take on like the challenges that the world offers. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? If you haven't formulated for yourself consciously an understanding of who the divine is, it makes it much harder to then be able to make sense of a world that really doesn't make any sense if you don't believe in God and you don't believe in an afterlife. It all is just confusing at the end of the day. Do you get what I mean? Is there anything that people want to share with others, announcements of any kind before we wrap up? Anything else that's happening or taking place?
I guess guess I had some thoughts from like what you two said about the prayer. I struggle with like connecting with the prayer too. But I mean, I try just to do it like anyway, and then I just realized like even when I was saying it, I realized that I feel like, you know, I appreciate those moments that I was able to connect, and I remember them like years later. I'll think about that moment and like what type of, I was thinking about how like only God can accept my salah. You know, that other person that's telling me, is it valid? I mean, I'm doing the best I can, and I know, you know, this is right, but I know how like people in the masjid can be. So if I'm doing what God told me to do, I can accept it, even if it's not valid. You know, God accepts. So like we just, because like, what if my intention was so pure? I hope that maybe it will be accepted.
Yeah, sure.
So, and then also about the, you know, it like hit me hard about that, you know, what if, you know, you do all this work and it's not really so much for me as like the feeling of, oh, I did all this work and I didn't benefit, or just, I guess it makes me sad that like I would have found, like I just wish that there was somebody that give me that advice I needed, like, oh, you're riding on the wrong side of the lane, you should be on this side, and you come out that day and you did all that work, and then like, you know, it's like, you know, you hear about these verses about hypocrisy, and it's like, what if I'm one of those people? And it makes me really sad. But then I know that's from shaitan. That's like, shaitan's making me feel that feeling that like God is not going to accept. But it's like the fact that I'm crying makes me like, should be a sign that I am sincere. So
yeah, mashallah, and
Inshallah,
Allah accept from you and accept from all of us. If you didn't have those thoughts that plagued you, it likely would be indicative of the fact that you weren't kind of where you needed to be. But Shaitan is jabbing you where you're vulnerable, because you're probably going down the route that he doesn't want to see you go down. And so you confront those and you stand up to them as best as you can, and we stand together. That's what community is about, right? We very purposely are meant to come together 5 times a day so that we're reinforcing one another, and we're able to then go back to what we're drawn towards in between with a little bit more strength and support from hearts that we've prayed in unison with. Right? That's why you want to talk to each other and learn each other's names. You go to some masjids and people have prayed next to each other for decades. They don't even know who they're praying next to, right? And it's not that that's a bad thing, but it's just so much better where you can deepen in love because you know the names of your sisters and brothers. You know what they're going through, what their experiences are, and you're there for them in meaningful ways, right? And what you just said is a very good segue to what we'll talk about next week, especially the part about like people butting in your business and constantly saying, this isn't good, that's not good, because this idea of the outer and inner self necessitates a conversation that speaks to very problematic mindsets and methodologies that are very reductive and focus purely on the outward and focus purely on the external alone as indicators of just conviction and sound faith, and breeds like a very pervasive form of judgmentalness that only exists in the prism of modernity. It didn't necessarily exist in the ways that we see it today centuries ago, where like Muslims really hate on other Muslims and make them feel like garbage, right? A person who's very religious would never actually make someone else feel like they aren't religious. It's just not a thing, right? The Prophet ﷺ, who is the best Muslim, never made someone else feel like they were a bad Muslim, right? Like, show me a hadith where somebody walked away being like, man, he made me feel like garbage, you know? Do you see what I mean? And when we talk about this, it's important because you don't want to be people who are just of the outward. You also don't want to be people who are just of the inner. You want to be in both directions, outer and inner, and understand that the inner impacts the outer in ways that you can really reflect like what's going on inside of me. So why don't we take a pause here? We prayed Isha before we started. So if people need to pray, feel free to pray. Otherwise, we'll see everybody next week in the Jummah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at ICNYU.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.